meaning that we achieved some steps recently, and this is no, no,
No micro.
no. And this? No. Where is the? No,
Deutsch no.
es el volumen en la sala. No. ¿Sí? ¿Ahora? No.
No. ¿Sí?
Un poquito más de volumen. Eh, dice que utilice el de la...
A la izquierda.
A ver. ¿Sí? ¿Ahora? Bueno, a veces el volumen de la sala... Sorry. Sometimes the volume in the hall is not enough because there are many people using the headphones. Well, as I said, this is... welcome to this event of the Socialist and Democrats groups on business and human rights agenda. Next steps. I said that if we are talking about next steps, it's because we did some steps recently, and welcome also to the speakers. Throughout this mandate, last period in the Parliament, our group has been fighting hard for binding rules to make sure companies take responsibility for people and the planet, and to make ethical business conduct the norm. Thanks to S&D-led initiatives such as the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive and Forced Labour Product Ban, corporate abuses might soon finally be addressed at EU level. On a global level, however, we are lacking effective mechanisms to hold companies accountable for human rights violations. This is why we are calling on the EU to engage more actively in the Geneva-based negotiations on the United Nations binding instruments on business and human rights, which could deliver the much-needed accountability. In this event, we would like to reflect on the progress achieved in this term and what are the next steps in tackling corporate human rights violations worldwide. We are having interpretation from and to Spanish, but lately I have been informed that we are having some problems with our guests invited from Guatemala, with some problems with the quality of sound that we are trying to overcome. And for the introductory remarks, I would like to give the floor to my dear colleague, Lara Walters, who has been personally leading the fight for corporate sustainability due diligence directive as the European Parliament rapporteur, which, despite all the blocks and obstacles, is now finally back on track to be adopted. Lara, please.
Thank you so much, Nacho. Thank you for organizing this here today. I think this is a very nice opportunity to take stock of the roller coaster that has been the past year, I think, and not to mention the last 5 years that it took to get this entire thing on the road, which was, of course, done with the help of so many of you in this room and the organizations that you represent. I think this truly has been a group effort of all those organizations involved, and a group effort in the S&D that, of course, in every committee where due diligence was on the agenda, grabbed the opportunity to provide rapporteurs. In terms of what this is about, I think that we have been very clear over the past mandate that for the S&D, a prosperous economy is not one that relies on human misery, not now, not in the future, and that it is not only possible for businesses to respect human rights, but that it is absolutely vital for us that they do so. Time and again, it's been the S&D who've advanced this agenda, from a ban on forced labor to action on deforestation, this mandate, batteries. In a world where environmental destruction is inseparable from the rights of human beings to their livelihoods, health and homes, I think we've made it very clear that human rights are at the heart of the green transition that we need. Now, of course, I've had the privilege to serve as S&D rapporteur for the due diligence directive, but really, again, this wouldn't have been possible without all those who flagged this early on in the mandate, who did all the work before this at UN level, at OECD level, and all those in the Parliament who helped me in this process. And I think that we can't understate how much of a game changer this legislation should be, in spite, of course, of recent developments. Now, those are extremely unfortunate, and I won't defend what has happened in terms of the changes to scope that were made. And yet, I think that this legislation, its content when it comes to liability, the involvement of stakeholders, the consequences of the actions of companies in terms of compensation, I think that this directive is vital and that we should congratulate ourselves, which is not something that we do often enough, perhaps. On the progressive side, we always think, what's next and how can we do things better? But I really think that here we can say well done to all those involved in at least getting this. And if there has been so much resistance, that has been, of course, because so much is at stake here. Again, I won't say that what we have here is perfect, not at all. There's more needed, but really there wouldn't have been this much resistance if this wasn't such a milestone. We will be the first continent now to draw a line and to say that no, European companies cannot profit from human rights abuses. And as the world's largest trading bloc, that matters. Companies, whether they're based here or not, they'll have to adhere to these rules if they want to continue to sell in and into Europe. Now, far from making Europe uncompetitive, I think that this is the potential to become a global benchmark that others might follow, spurring multinational businesses into action, very much in the same way that we were able to see with the GDPR and data protection. As I said, a project of such ambition has, of course, not been without its opposition. Even before negotiations got off the ground, business associations were trying to slow us down. Fast forward 2 years and 5 trilogues later, and the deal that we struck after a 16-hour negotiation last December was, of course, further attacked by business associations and certain governments who politically tried to use the opportunity to profile themselves. And the result was, of course, that the Belgian presidency was forced to make further concessions from the deal that we had struck to find a majority. And that's a situation that, of course, has not only occurred on this file, it's occurred across multiple files here. And after the elections, we have to absolutely make sure that we return to normal relations between the institutions, that we assert ourselves as the European Parliament, because this is no way of negotiating, of course, and this is bad for Europe as a whole. It's left a bitter taste in our mouths. I'm sure that I'm not the only one who feels that. But again, as I said, even with the concessions made, I think that human rights abuses will be prevented. Not all of them, but this legislation will prevent concrete cases of it, and it will help victims in getting to justice. I think that looking forward, which is of course the aim of today, the work for our group is not done. Advancing human rights and the relationship between business and human rights, that's a longer trajectory. So I think that very concretely what will need to be done in a next term on this is, of course, looking at the financial sector. The Commission will need to do that, and we will need to hold it to account to come forward with specific rules for the financial sector. I think we all know why that is vital, because around the world, finance is facilitating human rights projects that abuse human rights. Banks and investors continue to finance projects that cause human misery, and yet they have managed to exclude themselves from this directive. They have managed to persuade Emmanuel Macron that he needs to make a special case for them and not be held to account. That has to change. And I think that in parallel of that, we also need to have a much deeper look at how companies are run. What is needed essentially is overhauling an entire system that incentivizes short-term profits and that incentivizes those over human lives. If you're a company director in Europe, then the benchmark against which your performance is measured is measured by and large by how much cash you are returning to your shareholders. That's even legally in our legislation when it comes to fiduciary duties. That has to change. And if you want to do the right thing as a company, then you will face pushback from shareholders, and you will see very little reward for doing so and for trying to do so. I think that means that we need to build a system that empowers directors to make decisions for the long term. And of course, that does not mean that as the S&D that we are against profitability, that we are against prosperity or jobs, absolutely not. But that needs to be in a way that is sustainable for people and planet. Finally, I think we need to take a broader look and see how we can align existing legislation with the new standards that we have now made, from our approach to trade agreements, to public procurement, to how we control the export of arms. I think that there are so many pieces to this puzzle. Again, I won't claim that this one directive will change the world. I think it's a good step in the right direction, but more will need to be done over the next years, and you can count on the S&D to be at the forefront of that fight. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Lara. Thank you for your work, for your commitment, for your resilience, and this pressure that you describe, and congratulations for a provisional achievement. Provisional achievements. I think we have to, at the end, you notice how businesses and big corporations are using green policies as part of the communication tools. Okay, why not to try to introduce in the logic of the companies? If your company is respectful with human rights, this is an asset, at least in the most part of the European markets. Well, and I would like to now to introduce Carlos Choc. We had Carlos Choc in one human rights committee. Carlos Choc is connected remotely from Guatemala. He's an independent indigenous journalist reporting the activities of the foreign mining companies in his country. And as a result of this excellent professional work, he has faces judicial harassment and attacks, and he will now share his personal testimony. Carlos, tenemos alguna dificultad con la calidad del sonido. Te pediré que, en el caso de que no pueda haber traducción, hables lentamente, porque muchos colegas seguramente podrán seguir en general tu intervención, aunque solo puedan escucharla en español. Thank you. Go ahead. Adelante, Carlos.
Muchas gracias. Un saludo cordial para Nacho y también para todas y todos quienes están en esta reunión muy importante. Bueno, voy a presentarme rápidamente. Mi nombre es Carlos Ernesto Choc, periodista maya quechí, y soy parte del equipo binacional de la organización Liga Maya Internacional con sede en Estados Unidos. He enfrentado 2 procesos penales en mi contra por mi trabajo de investigación periodística sobre daños ambientales y violaciones a derechos humanos. Fueron 7 años de persecución penal y el 31 de enero de este año 2024 levantaron todos los cargos en mi contra. Acusaciones falsas de una empresa minera, especialmente Solway Investment Group, quien opera en el territorio. Y no solamente pues he sido víctima de criminalización, de represión, sino también han habido también pescadores, autoridades ancestrales, desde el año 2017. Todo comienza cuando el lago de Izabal, esta empresa minera, pues opera, y luego se tiñe de rojo en el 2017, en marzo, el lago de Izabal. El lago es la economía más grande que tiene la población, y esta economía estaba siendo muy afectada porque cuando el lago se tiñe de rojo, se contamina, los pescadores pues ya no pueden vender sus productos, exportar sus productos, y entonces empieza una situación muy complicada, muy difícil para la población, para las comunidades. Y bueno, se levantan, se movilizan y le empiezan a pedir al Estado, al gobierno de Jimmy Morales, que pues los escuchara, y eran 3 peticiones muy concretas las que tenían. Primero era que el gobierno, el mismo estado de Guatemala, analizara las aguas del lago de Izabal. y luego que se revisaran también los estudios de impacto ambiental que hizo la minera, y la tercera era que se hiciera una consulta comunitaria. Y cosa que no se realizó, sino más bien lo que comenzó fue una represión. El 27 de mayo del 2017 también documenté y presencié el asesinato de un hermano pescador, Carlos Maás. Y bueno, es una historia que también contamos en esta investigación periodística que fue que se terminó y que se publicó en marzo del año 2022. Magni Secret, si no estoy mal con mi inglés, Secretos Mineros. Fue una publicación, una colaboración también de varios colegas periodistas de Europa, una red de periodistas con el nombre Forbidden Story, con sede en París, Francia. Bueno, lo que sucede en ese momento, el asesinato de Carlos Maás, comienza no solamente el asesinato, sino una intimidación, una persecución penal, y son 12 personas, incluyéndome a mí como periodista, acusándonos de terroristas, acusándonos falsamente de, por ejemplo, instigación a delinquir. Son 5 delitos que nos imputa el Ministerio Público, un Ministerio Público que vemos actualmente con una jefa, o podríamos decir con la fiscal general, Consuelo Porras, que primero te imputa los delitos y luego investiga, cuando debería ser todo lo contrario, debería primero investigar para luego imputar delitos. Y debido a esta situación también que vemos en el Ministerio Público, pues sucede, pasan y somos señalados y somos buscados como delincuentes, como terroristas por el Estado de Guatemala. No solamente también nos acusan, sino nos empiezan como a intimidar, por ejemplo, trabajadores mineros de Solway, y comienza una serie de atentados. Por ejemplo, en mi caso, sufrí un atentado donde varias personas desconocidas allanan mi casa, se llevan todo lo que es mi equipo de trabajo periodístico. También eso sucedió en la pandemia, en el 2020, y luego en el 2021 sucede también en donde el ejército pues entra a mi casa y allana mi casa y trata de pues encontrar pues todo lo que me estaban acusando, ¿no? Y al final pues no encontraron nada. Justamente también lo hicieron con varios defensores, pescadores, autoridades ancestrales. La empresa minera es una empresa que ha violentado mucho los derechos humanos, no solamente el daño ambiental, como se tiñó de rojo el lago de Izabal, sino también, por ejemplo, no ha respetado en este caso sobre el tema de consulta. En la investigación periodística que pues tuve que enfrentar los procesos penales, como lo dije anteriormente, revelamos, por ejemplo, en esta revelación Secretos Mineros, Mining Secret, por ejemplo, cómo una empresa coopta no solamente a los líderes comunitarios, no solamente, por ejemplo, está cooptando a congresistas, por ejemplo, diputados, diputadas, sino también a un gobierno, y donde también le pide al gobierno que decrete estados de sitios donde las comunidades son incendiadas sus casas, las comunidades, por ejemplo, Palestina Chineval, en donde son expulsadas desde sus territorios, sus tierras, para favorecer, en este caso también, a la otra industria extractiva que es el monocultivo de palma, que está afectando muchísimo en este territorio quechí, que es Alta Verapaz, que es Izabal y que es Petén. Es muy difícil realmente lo que pues ha tenido que vivir el pueblo y lo que tenemos que vivir. Por ejemplo, en carne propia he tenido que vivir el desplazamiento forzado, en donde tengo que dejar mi comunidad, tengo que dejar mi familia para poder entonces sobrevivir, para poder seguir haciendo mi trabajo de investigación. Y realmente quiero pues no redundar mucho, solo compartirles a ustedes que para el pueblo quechí hay una crisis realmente climática. Lo ven porque todos los impactos negativos, los daños ambientales que ha generado la mina han sido bastante difíciles, como por ejemplo en los cultivos de maíz, frijol, plátanos, ya no son como antes. Y esto a través de también, nosotros hicimos una investigación, monitorear el aire cuando monitoreamos el aire, pues cuando la minera estaba en plena actividad, explotación en el 2020-2021, realmente lo que sucedía era de que en el aire habían muchas partículas de metales, y esto pues empieza también, se ve no solamente en los cultivos, sino en los techos de las casas, de las viviendas, que son metales, láminas, y empieza, digamos, cuando llueve, empieza a pintarse de rojo, ¿no? Las viviendas. Entonces, esto es preocupante porque también podríamos hablar sobre enfermedades de la piel. Nosotros tuvimos la oportunidad de investigar, en esta investigación, hablar con un doctor especialista, pero resulta que cuando nos da la entrevista es removido de su cargo por el Ministerio de Salud, por el mismo estado de Guatemala. Entonces, realmente lo que está viviendo, lo que sufrimos en carne propia, lo que son las enfermedades respiratorias, las enfermedades de piel, pues realmente el estado de Guatemala, con un presidente que estaba, Alejandro Yamatei, ha escondido muchísimo pues esta realidad. Y lo otro también, que ha querido negar Jimmy Morales y Alejandro Yamatei el asesinato del pescador, porque en una manifestación pacífica fue asesinado Carlos Maas, reitero, el 27 de mayo del 2017, por la Policía Nacional Civil. Fue la policía, están las fotos, y cuando se muestran las fotos, pues las mismas autoridades del estado dicen científicamente no es, no se ve que la policía mató a Carlos Maas. Cuando se ve, realmente hay videos y hay fotografías donde pues está el policía disparando justo a Carlos Maas. Voy a avanzar rápidamente y, por ejemplo, esta situación sucede que las autoridades ancestrales no fueron tomadas en cuenta en el 2021 en una consulta comunitaria. Esta consulta comunitaria, donde la misma empresa minera elabora la estrategia de hacer una consulta y se la pasa al estado de Guatemala. Eso fue revelado en la investigación que nosotros también publicamos en Secretos Mineros, y debería ser todo lo contrario. Debería ser, por ejemplo, el estado de Guatemala, a través del Ministerio de Energía y Minas, pues trasladar de cómo se van a hacer los pasos, de cómo se van a llevar el proceso de consulta, y realmente es todo lo contrario. Y es preocupante también porque, por ejemplo, en este caso tuvo que venir Estados Unidos no solamente Por ejemplo, las autoridades comunitarias hicieron acciones legales en donde las mayores cortes como la Corte Suprema de Justicia, la Corte de Constitucionalidad les favoreció, diciéndole entonces sacando una sentencia incluso en donde detienen las operaciones de la mina, como es la Corte de Constitucionalidad, la CC, ordena que se detenga las operaciones de la mina y que se convoque a una consulta. Y entonces algo también muy histórico lo que sucede en esta resistencia, en esta lucha, en esta defensa de la madre tierra, es de que la misma Corte de Constitucionalidad, no con estos magistrados que están ahorita, porque estos magistrados están totalmente pues cooptados por el pacto de corruptos, hasta ahí lo dejo, pero los anteriores magistrados de la CC detienen las operaciones, hay una resolución, hay una sentencia y ordena una consulta. Caso que no quiso pues atender Solway, continuó operando y cuando continuó operando incluso en pandemia aumentó la producción del ferroníquel, aumentó la explotación porque no solamente se estaban llevando procesado el ferroníquel, sino también se estaban llevando, por ejemplo, lo que es las tierras, nosotros le llamamos el producto bruto, y en estas tierras también están las tierras raras y se estaban llevando también incluso en la investigación refleja lo que es el uranio, también otros metales que se estaba llevando. Y bueno, al no atender a Alejandro y a Matei y al no escuchar a las autoridades ancestrales que se levantan en el 2021 para pedirles que sean tomados en cuenta, pues viene el Departamento de Tesoros de Estados Unidos, la OFAC, en el 2022, en diciembre, pues ya sanciona a la mina. Sanciona a la mina por corrupción y también no solamente por corrupción, sino también por violaciones a derechos humanos. Entonces, esta sanción hasta el momento ha detenido las operaciones de la mina, porque si no fuese el Departamento de Tesoros, la OFAC de Estados Unidos, la mina continúa, la mina sigue, por ejemplo, criminalizando, la mina sigue acusando falsamente a defensoras y defensores y también sigue haciendo mucho daño en el tema ambiental y también generando muchas enfermedades en la piel, respiratorio en las comunidades.
Carlos,
Hasta el momento.
tenemos que ir terminando, Carlos, para pasar a la otra
Sí,
fase.
gracias,
Gracias.
gracias. Hasta el momento, bueno, estamos en esto de que tenemos un gobierno como, por ejemplo, Bernardo Arévalo, que pues le ha puesto mucho interés en este momento lo que es el tema de las licencias mineras, que muchas licencias pues las están revisando y Solway pues actualmente sigue suspendida. Muchísimas gracias por el espacio y quiero terminar con estas palabras de las autoridades ancestrales de mi pueblo. La madre naturaleza es nuestra casa y ya no más extractivismo. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Carlos. Antes de pasar al inglés, me alegro de que tu situación personal y la de las otras personas acusadas se haya resuelto y espero que las nuevas autoridades del país, después de un proceso electoral complicado en el que la procuradora que te persigue era un elemento esencial para impedir el cambio político, nos alegramos de que nos haya logrado ya una nueva administración. Thank you, Carlos. Very happy that your personal situation and your colleagues are better. Now we are passing to the panel in which my dear colleague María Manuel Leitao Márquez is chairing.
Thank you, Nacho. Welcome to all panelists, and thank you very much to be with us today. In this panel, we will take stock of where we are now and what we need to do next to prevent corporate human rights abuse worldwide. We need that the protection of human rights is included by default from the very beginning in the design of business, as well as in their day-to-day operation, including in the selection of their suppliers. As you know, this mandate we approve key legislation in this field, such as Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, as my colleague said before, and forced labor ban regulation. Together, these two pieces of legislation aim to assure directly or indirectly that companies join the fight for human rights and sustainability. As Nash said before, this should be an issue of reputation, if, as it is nowadays with environment. Having said this, there are surely areas where we still need to work on. And first of all, we need to closely follow up the implementation of these two pieces of legislation to make sure they will achieve the goals they have on paper. We need a similar law in action as law in books, at least. With this next expert panel, we hope to take a broad view and look towards the future for the next steps to deliver on a more ethical and responsible business landscape where human rights are protected. We have an excellent selection of guest speakers to discuss with. First, Lynn Wenneland or Wenneland? Wendland, Chief of the Business and Human Rights Section of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, who is bringing us the global perspective from Geneva, and Hélène de Rangerve, you senior advisor from Anti-Slavery International, a very important voice in our work in the European Parliament, bringing us the civil society, so important civil society perspective. I would now give the floor to each panelist for 8 minutes and then open the floor for the questions from the audience, starting with Lynn. The floor is yours, and thank you very much again.
Thank you very much for the invitation to join this very important event, which comes at a pivotal moment in time, as we've heard, just a couple of weeks away from the expected adoption of probably the most important piece of regulation in the field of business and human rights, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and arguably among the most important developments in the field of business and human rights since the endorsement by the UN Human Rights Council of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights in 2011. The adoption will be the culmination of a long and extensive, and I'm sure colleagues on the panel will say exhaustive process. And I strongly urge the Parliament to vote in favor, going to the last vote, of the revised proposal, which still contains, as Lara Walter was saying, some key, the core elements of the human rights due diligence process as set out in the international standards. So despite and with the further compromise that were made, we still urge that this pivotal piece of regulation be adopted so we can move on to the implementation stage. To paraphrase the author of the guiding principles, John Ruggie, the final adoption of the CS3D will be the end of the beginning. Only the end of the beginning. The effective implementation will require a lot from all of us, all stakeholders, all of us in this room and beyond. So I hope that once adopted, we can all move on and move on from some of the more divisive debates of the past years and proceed in a way that despite the challenges, advances the course of human rights in business in a constructive and principled but pragmatic way. And this implies recognizing some of the practical challenges faced by those companies who will be within the scope of the directive, but also the need to build capacity of them and of others, as well as building effective supervisory mechanisms to enable effective enforcement and implementation of the directive across the EU member states. As we've heard, the CS3D is arguably the most important, but it sits along a number of other really important developments, the forced labor regulation, deforestation, and other speakers have alluded to it, complemented by sector-specific regulation and initiative, for example, in the area of tech, the Digital Services Act, a really important piece of regulation as well that has implications for obviously a very important sector, and is also based on and reflecting in key elements the guiding principles. There are other sector initiatives in the cocoa sector and others. So I think alongside initiatives and support for civil society organizations, support for organizations like the UN Human Rights Office, working with partners, with the support also from EU to embed and implement the standards at the national level in different parts of the world. I think all these measures are really important as a combination of measures that go a long way towards embodying the UN Guiding Principles' famous phrase of the smart mix of measures. John Ruggie, the author of the Guiding Principles, rightly identified the need for states to adopt such a mix of measures, mandatory and voluntary, international and regional, or international and national, to foster respect for human rights. As an eminent political scientist, he recognized that transformational societal change only come about when legal and social norms and expectations complement each other to create the right combination of measures to encourage, incentivize, and compel change. While John is sadly no longer with us, I'm convinced that even he would be surprised and amazed at the relative scale and speed with which EU institutions have moved to advance the smart mix through the development of this array of regulatory instruments and supporting measures. So I congratulate very much the European Parliament in playing such a constructive role in many of these developments. But not all the action has been, of course, at the EU. Since 2014, at the UN, an intergovernmental working group has been tasked by the UN Human Rights Council to develop legally binding instrument on business and human rights. And we heard our colleague here referring to that earlier. While the process has been challenging, the recommendations made at the end of last year's session, so the 9th session, and the recent roadmap issued by the Ambassador of Ecuador, who chairs the process, to prepare for the 10th session in October this year, that we hope will help pave the way for progress on some of the key issues. From the beginning of the process, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has called on all states and all actors to participate constructively in the negotiations on the new instrument. It's hoped that with the expected adoption of the CS3D, the EU will be able to come to Geneva with a mandate to negotiate the text, and that EU member states, several of whom of course already have national standards relevant to the mandate of this intergovernmental working group, will come prepared to actively engage in the process. And in this context, I note the European Parliament resolution from earlier this year, which contained recommendations for shaping the EU's position on the UN binding instrument on business and human rights, in particular with regard to access to remedy and the protection of victims. But while recognizing many of these important developments that have been taking place since the adoption of the guiding principles in 2011, including the momentum towards the regulatory equation of the smart mix, we should all be acutely aware that for many, these developments have not come soon enough. Many human rights defenders, trade unions, and impacted communities have faced and continue to face challenges and risks in the standing up for their rights and seeking remedy for harm. And I'm sorry, my Spanish was not sufficient to follow, but I think I got the general direction as an illustration of that very point. And these challenges are not because we don't know what to do about this. The UN Guiding Principles set out the framework, both for states and for companies, on how to protect and mitigate against harm. And from the Office of the High Commissioner side, we have worked for over a decade on our accountability and remedy project that is mandated by the Human Rights Council, where we developed knowledge and practical guidance, including for companies, on how to ensure access to effective remedy through judicial and non-judicial mechanisms. And just last week, we published an interpretive guide on access to remedy. So it's part of our series of sort of commentary and interpretive guidance on the different elements of the guiding principles. So an interpretive guide on access to remedy, the third pillar of the guiding principles, that is based on this extensive work we have carried out with all stakeholders on how to make this essential component of the UNGPs a reality for those who need it. We're also providing advice and support for companies who are seeking but sometimes struggling to implement the UNGPs across their operations and value chains. In addition to working directly with companies who are reaching out to us, we issue authoritative interpretation and guidance on key aspects on the UNGPs, both through these interpretive guides, but also, for example, guidance notes that we issued, the most recent one at the end of last year, on what the guiding principles say to companies when they're operating in challenging context, including conflict. And that is obviously an issue that many companies are struggling with. And we think it's really important to understand what are the human rights responsibilities under the guiding principles in these contexts. We also increasingly work at the regional and country level to support effective implementation by both states and companies, and supporting CSOs in claiming their rights in the context of business. And I mentioned earlier that we are working with partners, other UN agencies, the OECD, including with support from the EU to enable those kind of national level activities and embedding. So based on the work that we and many others are doing to advance business and human rights, it's clear that we don't need to wait for all these important legal and policy measures to take effect. And they are crucial, they're important, and we are fully supporting them. But they can take a while to take effect in practice. So it really is important to recognize that we need all hands on deck here. There are a lot of people who can't wait for the regulatory processes, as important as they are, to take effect, either at the regional, national, or international level. So we look forward to continuing working with all of you and with EU institutions to achieve that. I just want to end by just picking up on a couple of more points. Lara Walters mentioned in terms of the future, the focus of the finance sector, and we would be strongly supportive of that. We have already a body of work that is where we have issued guidance on the application of the UN guiding principles to different parts of the financial sector, and we would certainly be very keen to support measures in the coming parliament for that. And so, just ending, is the glass half full or half empty? I think when we are taking stock and when we're looking forward, I think it's really important, I think, to recognize all the progress that has been made. I mentioned that already. I think we are all, and someone mentioned as well, we tend to sort of be, we need more, and it's not good enough, and it's not aligned. But sometimes I think really saying this is progress. It's not perfect, and it's not all aligned with the international standards in a perfect alignment, or indeed necessarily aligned all these initiatives with each other. But still, the cumulative effect, I think, means that we can look forward to having many more instruments available, many more tools, approaches available to enable the progress that rights holders and those at risk are needing us to engage in. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your optimism and the hope we share with us. So I move to our next speaker, that is Hélène. Hélène, the floor is yours. You are someone that we see frequently here in the Parliament discussing and helping us in our fight to protect human rights in business. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation, Maria Emanuel. Indeed, I've been present not only here, but also towards other institutions, and I think we've been trying indeed to work constructively with everyone to make sure that we have a good result. So, dear Chair, dear distinguished MEPs, guests, and colleagues, I've been asked to answer this very broad question on what's next on business and human rights, which probably would need more than 8 minutes and the help of all of you in this room to address meaningfully. So it's only, I believe it's only through cooperation between businesses, governments, and civil society and trade unions, which we are missing because our colleagues from ETU couldn't be there, that we can design a true way forward. Hence, I will focus on key issues only, but first I would like to brush over the current context. Business and human rights issues are embedded into a complex world. We are in the midst of a climate, nature, and inequality crisis where different factors interact with each other. We all face an uncertain future with an increasing number of conflicts affecting the security, trade, and living conditions of all. And we also face a steep increase in poverty rates. Climate change, extreme weather events, and the environmental crisis have led to an increase in climate-related migrations, further leading to a growth in vulnerable people and thus in forced labor in private supply chains. And the rise of autocracy worldwide and of the far right in Europe has led to a decline in democracy that further jeopardizes the ability of workers and communities to speak up. All these factors increase the vulnerabilities of our world, and in particular of the communities that are directly affected, as demonstrated by Carlos' testimony. Furthermore, businesses are stuck between contradictory expectations and demands. On one side, they want less regulations, less reporting obligations, less taxes, less social obligations to ensure flexibility and adaptability. But on the other side, they also want more. They want a more harmonized market, they want more protection against unfair competition, they want more direct financial support, and more predictability and security for their operations. My feeling is that not all of it can be possible. So in terms of what's next, I would like to focus on 3 key domains of progress and a few suggestions for further legislative development. First, a key domain of progress for me is that companies need to change their ways of operating. By moving from a short-term vision focused on shareholder profits towards a long-term vision allowing for a fairer development for all. By being open to more transparency about their supply chains, their flows, and also about their efforts to remediate them. By being more diverse, equitable, and inclusive to foster a culture of respect and belonging in and out of their company. Sharing knowledge and experience with other partners, including on how to manage human and labor rights violations, will allow all of us to build sustainable and long-term solutions together. And finally, by moving from compliance to prevention. Zero risk and zero tolerance policies are a fantasy nowadays, and therefore cut and runs no longer are a viable solution. Companies must manage the human rights and environmental violations they face individually and collectively. The second key domain of progress is that we need companies to truly commit to multi-stakeholder approaches. Preventing, mitigating, bringing to an end, and remediating human rights violations and environmental adverse impact can only be done through joint and collective actions, by ensuring the right to association and to collective bargaining, and by connecting through meaningful and long-term stakeholder engagement. These are prerequisites to create safety, trust, and mutual benefit, thus contributing to sustainable development and positive impact. Third and last, policymakers need to prepare for a just and equitable transition where human rights, environmental sustainability, and the well-being of all communities affected by the move towards clean energy must be prioritized. These key elements of progress can be translated more concretely in terms of legislative developments. A lot has been achieved already, and we've heard it from my colleagues, with the Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive, with the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, with the Battery Regulation, the Forced Labor Regulation, etc. But some further efforts are needed to reinforce their potential impact. The first one is the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, the SFDR, that will have to be aligned with the outputs and effects of the CS3D and the CSRD. On the CSRD, sector-specific standards should be developed as soon as possible, as was initially foreseen, and adopted for high-impact industries to clarify what the reporting expectations are on a sectoral basis. It would make compliance easier for companies while preserving high-quality information, amongst others, for investors. On the forced labor regulation, there is a need for a good guidance on how to hand and remediate forced labor to create an incentive for greater action, even though we don't have it as a compulsory element in the forced labor regulation. And there is a need to build a strong database, including regions that are at risk of state-imposed forced labor, to allow companies to identify forced labor risk in their supply chains. On the CS3D, there is a need for good guidance on climate transition plans that clarifies the expectation on companies, provide tools for implementation, and makes the assessment of the quality of transition plans easier. The EC should facilitate the use and sharing of technologies to ensure a greater traceability and transparency of supply chains. And it should also ensure a fair distribution of accompanying measures to support equally CSOs, local communities, and trade unions, as well as companies in their implementation of the directive. Given the general outcome, the final outcome on the CS3D, there are indeed a few gaps. As mentioned by Lara, we also would like to see a greater focus on the finance sector, but corporate governance remains a big gap also in terms of aligning business conduct with international standards. Due diligence should not be isolated in the legal department, but rather be integrated in the company-wide policy and change process. As high-risk sectors have also been excluded from the CS3D, other sectoral legislations are needed, in particular to further the work done on the EU strategy on sustainable and circular textile. There, the EU could work on a directive to ban unfair trading practices in garment and textile, modeling the one existing for agri-food. On one of the points also that is very much linked to the forced labor regulation and to the CS3D is that we will need, in the current revision on the Union Custom Code, we will need that trade data has made transparent so that we can actually use it into the identification of risk and forced labor into the supply chain. Finally, the EU should actively contribute and support the negotiation on a UN binding treaty on business and human rights, and as a cross-cutting effort, lawmakers should improve labor conditions for all workers, including migrant workers, in all its upcoming initiatives, whether addressing the green and digital transition, transport, agriculture, or other sectors. It can do so by including specific provisions to improve working conditions and promote a fair and just transition for all workers, regardless of their employment or residence status. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Helene. And now I open the floor for questions. Can you?
Yes. My name is Stella Veliki. I have studied physics and informatics. I'm a member of the European Physical Society. It's very interesting for the human rights and business. My question is, okay, you have a lot of projects, a lot of directives, it's very good, but how do you punish the company which don't respect the human rights? Do you have a database from these companies? Yes, I am a company, I want to make some business with another company, I want to see if this company is respecting the human rights. You have a database for that on EU level or on international level? And this question, they are for UN level and also for EU level. Huh?
Maybe more one or two questions, and after I'll pass the floor to our, please.
Oh, yes, thank you. I'm Munti Ingwersen. I'm from the Dutch banking sector, banking association. And as you might notice, that the Dutch financial sector is very in favor to fall in the scope of the CSDDD. And we're looking now with the Dutch banks into how to sort of anticipate, maybe on a voluntary basis, to implement parts of the CSDDD. But it's more a question to any of you, if you recommend us to take certain steps to sort of increase the chances of the financial sector falling into scope. Maybe not now, but in the future.
Are there more questions? If not, I'm also have a question for our guests. From your experience on the ground, what will be the main obstacles to the implementation of the forced labor regulation as it was approved?
Thank you. So on the first question on how to punish companies, I mean there is a lot to say on that. As I said, we've been leading this this work, the Accountability and Remedy Project, which sets out what clarifying issues, how to have jurisdictional clarity, how to have course of action in cross-border cases. It sort of aligning, making courts more accessible, making state-based non-judicial systems, so consumer protection, environmental agencies, etc., more effective in monitoring and in imposing sanctions or fines or whatever the case may be, in terms of companies that are not adhering to the core standards, including on those with human rights. So I think there is a lot that we know that can be made more effective in order to ensure proper accountability, whether that accountability sits within the judicial system, whether it sits within the non-judicial system, so in more supervisory bodies, or indeed how to make company mechanisms more effective and more accessible to hear complaints from those who feel that their rights have been impacted, and how these systems would work together. Because again, punishment is one thing, but there are a lot of other measures that for those who have been impacted can be even more important. It could be assurances of non-repetition, potentially financial compensation if that's appropriate, or taking measures of further transparency. Again, depending on the particular case, what accountability means will vary from situation to situation, and what the guiding principles are setting out is that those who have a claim, they need to be able to have a choice of what is the most appropriate mechanisms that they can approach, and they need to understand it. It needs to be predictable. It needs to be transparent. They need to understand what it is what remediation or what restitution they might be able to provide. So I think there is, we could have many sessions focused only on that. I think the short answer to your question on the database, I think that is one thing that many within, for example, public procurement agencies that are looking to sort of direct public procurement towards companies that are acting more responsible. Again, there is not a centralized, I think, at EU level, I don't think that's anticipated, but I think those kinds of measures to make breaches of these norms around human rights, make them become an impediment to get new business, for example. If you are supplying to through public procurement, it could be a very big business to lose if you are not adhering. So I think there are many different instruments and approaches, and all of them need to be in play, because there is not the kind of cases we're talking about, the scale and the scope of them. There's not one single sort of measure that would get to where we want to go in terms of ensuring where there has been harm, that there is accountability and remedy for those that are harmed. For the Dutch banking, I mean, of course, you've had the banking, the Dutch, what is it called? The bank agreement, the sector agreement.
You mean the Dutch climate agreement?
No,
or?
the banking, anyway.
The covenants.
The government,
yes.
yes. And I think that there's been some really important developments undertaken at that national sectoral level, which I think we've been supporting. I think falling within the scope in a voluntary measure, I think when I say it's not, I mean, it's pretty simple, and of course it's not simple, but I think it is about financial institutions, banks or other parts of the sector look at the guidance that exists for what are the responsibilities if you are a bank under the UN guidelines, under the OECD guidelines, which have developed many financial sector specific due diligence guides. And if financial institutions are following that guidance, then they will be a very long way towards, you know, having been within the scope of the CS3D. I think there has been a lot of very good work done by a number of people in terms of how these norms and expectations around due diligence could be implemented in practice by banks and other parts of the financial sector. And so I think one doesn't have to wait until the next parliament, and if there is an agreement for include financial institutions within the scope. So I think there is a lot of work that is already very good. I'll maybe leave the forced labor question to my colleague, who I think is more in the weeds on that.
Would you like to add something? Yes, of course.
I can definitely answer, but I can be short. I feel that
Yes,
there is
yes,
a
please, because
constraint of time.
We need to vote.
Sorry, so let's be very quick then. There's no database indeed foreseen. There is one that will be foreseen in the forced labor regulation, but it won't include names of companies, so companies won't be named there. And unfortunately, that's not something we managed to maintain in the text. On the financial sector, I would say, I mean, to complement what Mrs. Van Land said, I think you need to speak up, and you need to speak again and again and again with your counterparts of all countries, because it's only by demonstrating that you are getting to a more sustainable and more competitive actually situation as a bank and as a banking sector in the Netherlands that you will also incentivize others to do the same. So speak up, join forces with some of my NGO partners like Share Action that are working on finance sector, demonstrate that what you are doing is possible and is effective, and that really is also something that will help the work of the lawmakers to actually demonstrate what can be done. And just a very quick answer on your question, main obstacles for the implementation of the forced labor regulation? Too many, but the very big one I would say is that we'll have to, instead of having an instrument that allows us to tackle at scale situation of forced labor, we'll have to go product by product by product by product to get any result, and that will be cumbersome for everyone, not only for the CSOs and the trade unions and the workers that will want to bring up complaints, but also for the institution and the implementing authorities. So I think that will be the main obstacle.
Thank you, Hélène. We continue to speak also about the customs, and I would like to know more about your suggestion. Now I give the floor to Udo Bullman to close our workers, and thank you all for attendance.
Thank you so much, Maria Manuel. Distinguished speakers, honorable guests, it's my privilege to draw 2 or 3 lines very quickly because our plenary is going to start timely at 5, so we have to move over. Yes, it was clear by your contributions that in an increasingly globalized world, multinational corporations have an unprecedented influence. And we have to realize that, and we have to draw conclusions from that. We need, that is our first learning from Carlos in Guatemala, from his example and from the conversation of our experts. We need a robust mechanism to hold businesses accountable. We need to promote values in the business world, not in order so much to punish corporations. This is not the issue. We need to protect people. We need to protect people, and we need to protect the environment. That is first and foremost our motivation why we are driving this issue further and further. But there's also a second element. what we can realize, and Lene, you are permanently speaking about that, there's a new generation of managers. There is a new generation of business people. There is a new generation of people in small and medium-sized enterprises who would like to live up to values in the business world, who would like to promote different business models. And the question of our speaker from the Netherlands was clear about that. We are already preparing for that in the financial world. Yeah, bravo. This is what we would like to see, that the financial sector is already preparing for that. Exactly, this is what is needed. But then we immediately enter into an unequal level playing field. And here it has to have rules. Because we should not, it's about punishment, we should not punish those who really have started to new sustainable endeavors, who would like to contribute to the 2030 sustainability strategy. These guys have to have a fair chance. So within a competitive world, we have to find rules that promote the pioneers of sustainability and justice. This is what it is all about. We need to realize that we have an immense leverage, immense influence. This example of Carlos on the extractive industries in Guatemala is a challenge for us. We have to introduce our values via our regulations. We have to hinder human rights abuses from coming into existence. And of course, we have to protect the environment so that it cannot be destructed more than we had it already in the past. That very much reminds me on what UN High Commissioner for Human Rights is talking about when he mentions the necessity of a human rights economy that has to be promoted within our regulatory framework. And that leads me directly to our last lesson, my learning lesson to be taken from today. We cannot stop at the EU level. No, we have to go global, and we need to incentivize the European institutions to more closely, to more, with more commitment, to collaborate and to negotiate for a UN binding instrument on business and human rights. This is exactly what we are looking for. That has to be the collective aim. And we would invite all stakeholders from the business world, all stakeholders from the media, the journalists, to carry on together with the Socialists and Democrats, also in the new mandate to make our ideas, our vision of a sustainable business world, of a just business world, a reality. Thanks a lot, I would say, in my capacity as chair of the Subcommittee of Human Rights, to the S&D team, to you, Maria Manuel, and to Nacho, who had to leave already, for promoting this issue and for bringing us together today. And thanks everybody for pushing forward for the right goals. And I have to close this meeting now. Hope to see you soon again. Thank you again.